This is the Giant Mouse Ace Clyde. And in fact, we've got it in two versions here. In M390 and brass, and in 20 CV and denim linen micarta. This is a really surprisingly good EDC, and despite being one of Giant Mouse's older models, has a lot of the things they've really started to bring into the brand more recently. So I find this to be a really interesting knife. I'm going to talk about why. My goal with these reviews is to provide a single video that gives you everything you need to know about these knives to make an informed purchase decision and know whether this should be part of your collection or not. I'm going to try to do that as quickly as possible through 5 sections. First, we're going to talk about specifications, overall design, overall weight, size, price, things like that. Then we'll talk about what I like, talk about some things that I don't like, follow up with fit, finish, and value, and then just conclude with some overall thoughts. Let's get to it. And I'm going to focus this review on the denim linen micarta version, which is in just about every way to me the superior version. We'll bring the brass one in at the very end. So the Giant Mouse Ace Clyde is maybe the second oldest design in Giant Mouse's lineup. Years old, came out basically alongside the Biblio, maybe a little bit after. It's a very simple knife. You've got a much more angular design than a lot of Giant Mouse designs here, with pretty much a straight line. You can see they're not actually technically straight lines. There's a little bit of curve to everything, but it looks like a bunch of sharp angles. Pretty much a flat here, pretty much a flat back here, angular around the butt, a little very gentle subtle curve across the bottom, but pretty much this entire bottom is just about a straight line with just that little bit of curve. Just a lot of angles, especially when you fold it up, very nice and squared off. And then you open this blade, and you've got what is slightly a trailing point design, where this tip is actually slightly above the tip or the back of your scale here. Looks at first like a flat, but if you put this, and you'll see it if you ever put it on a table like that, you will see that this actually does curve up a little bit at the tip. 130 thousandths on the blade stock, which is, right in the middle range of things. Thinner than your PM2, about the same as something like a Sage 3. Some of your thinner hinderers come in at this range. Again, this one is 20 CV. Your blade is 3 inches. I think it's just a little bit under 3 inches. Your whole knife is 7 inches long. And this version here, despite having a 3-inch blade and a liner lock, is only 2.81 ounces. So it is pretty light. Let's do some quick size comparisons here. Pull out your Para 3. And you can see this is about the same length as your Para 3, but a significantly smaller knife overall. The Para 3 is significantly thicker everywhere, but you're getting about the same overall blade length, and in fact more cutting edge length, with the same, if anything, a slightly smaller handle length in the Clyde than in the Para 3. You compare it to your PM2, if that's your sort of base of comparison, you can see significantly smaller on every dimension. Not just thinner. If you compare these this way, you can see it is very significantly thinner than your PM2, and it feels that way in the pocket. You are getting a blade that, in terms of cutting edge, it's almost the same cutting edge as your PM2, but the blade overall is a bit shorter. The handle is significantly shorter, and it is way smaller in the pocket because of how much less tall it is. Compare this to a small knife like your Delica, and you will see still you're getting more cutting edge. You're getting still plenty of usable handle, about the same length, a little bit less handle, more cutting edge, and it is still less tall than the Delica. And so when you fold this up, it ends up taking up even less space in the pocket. And it's even about the same thickness, maybe a tiny bit thicker than your Delica. It feels smaller in the pocket than the Delica. The one knife that I can really compare it to, sorry for the wobble there, is your small Sebenza. This carries almost the same, and if anything a little bit smaller, especially in this linen micarta version where it's lighter, this carries almost the same as a small Sebenza, which is a very small knife in the pocket, And when you open it up here, you will see you got very similar dimensions. A little bit less handle, a little bit less blade, but this is small Sebenza size. It also has a very similar action to a small Sebenza, the sort of very smooth hydraulic action you get with a Sebenza here. You get a very similar action with the Clyde. Thumb stud action, very nice grind, just barely sub 3-inch blade. This very much feels like Giant Mouse's take on the Sebenza platform. So those are our specs. Let's talk about what is great about the Clyde, because there are some things that are truly great about this knife. The first thing that is great is what I was talking about as I went through those size comparisons. The carry profile of the Clyde is fantastic, and unexpectedly so. When you look at this knife on paper, and even when you look at its specs, when you look at length, weight, things like that, it looks like a small knife on paper. But really, because of how not tall this handle is, and because that entire blade folds up in the handle there, sorry about that, you are getting a decent sized blade, 3 inches, especially with this big sweeping belly, which we'll talk about later. This is plenty of blade to do most of the stuff that you need to do with a knife. And you get it in a very, very easy to carry package. It is thin, it is light, sub 3 ounces. It takes up no space in your pocket, but still, as we'll talk about as we get into ergonomics in the blade, still gives you the performance of a full-size knife. And that is far and away the most impressive thing about the design and execution of the Clyde. And it is the most surprising thing, is the thing that surprised me the most when I started to use it, is that this is a shockingly small knife in all the ways that a small knife is beneficial. This is a knife that you just don't even feel in your pocket. Honestly, it feels like carrying a couple sticks of gum tape together. And that's really pleasant, and led to me carrying this one a lot more than I expected. You know, I carry all of my knives before I review them, but this is one that I end up carrying more than just for the review. This, for a period, was the knife that I just wanted to carry around, especially if I was going to do, lighter duty tasks that day, because it is so small, it's so light. And then let's get to the blade, because this blade is also surprisingly great. Trailing point blades, where you got here, this is a full belly. There is not, technically this back part might be a little flat, but this is basically a giant belly all the way from the tip down to the base. Trailing points, you see them in skinning knives and things like that, fillet knives. These are blades that are designed to be fantastic for long, gradual cuts, like you do when you're butchering a carcass or skinning something or filleting a fish, where because you've got a long continuous belly, it's very easy to enter the cut from anywhere on that belly, sweep through, and continuously keep that blade in the cut. And as expected, this works really well for those cuts. And the fact that they chose 13 thousandths on the stock, which is not thin, they could have gone thinner if they wanted to, but it's not thick either. And the way that they ground this, you can see the flat carries pretty much out to the tip. It's only toward the very, very tip that it starts to thin out. So they kept a lot of thickness here. This is a relatively tough blade shape because of the way they saber ground this. But this, because it's got all this belly, it is really good for those long, gradual cuts, which not only do you experience if you're doing something like, cutting meat or fish or anything like that, which it's great for, but these are also when you're doing, say, a cut out in the garden, and you're trying to cut through a branch, and you want to continuously saw through it. Or if you're cutting through, a thicket of a bunch of like weeds and things like that, and you want to continuously just keep cutting. If you're cutting through even a cardboard box and you want to make a long cut and just not have to worry about sort of focusing on keeping the edge in the cut, and you just want to sweep your hand through and have the blade naturally stay in the cut, this trailing point is great. It does everything you would expect a trailing point to do. And on top of that, because your tip and because the tip of your edge is even above the top of the handle, very easy as you're holding this knife to always get the edge into the cut. If I'm holding, say, a piece of twine or something like that, this whole edge is basically in front of my hand. It's on this side of my hand. So whatever I'm cutting into, I'm always presenting the edge very naturally in a way that you don't always get with something like, like this sheep's footy design on the Delica, where because this tip is a little lower, sometimes I have to cant my hand back to get around and into something. With a high tip like this, the blade edge is pretty much always very easily accessible. It's great. Now, the problem with some larger trailing points, and you often see trailing points on very big knives. Top of head, Emerson. Emerson does some fantastic trailing point knives. Their Hatin, their Rendezvous in a way is a trailing point knife. They have a lot of these knives with these big bellies and these high tips that are great. I mean, they're meant as skinning knives and things like that. But those knives, because the tips are so high, often are outright bad at your basic utility cuts. If you're trying to, just cut into an Amazon box or just break some twine or even do, piercing cuts into a wall or something like that, it's often hard to get to that tip with precision. But this is only a 3-inch blade. And it's a very small 3-inch blade. And it's a 3-inch blade that ergonomically, because it's such a small handle, it's very easy to pinch up on this blade. This ends up being a trailing point with almost none of the typical drawbacks of a trailing point. Because the drawbacks of a typical trailing point are accessibility of that edge. That when you want to make that big sweeping cut, the edge will always be in the cut, but you don't have as much precise control over the edge as you would with something like a Wharncliffe or a sheep's foot, or even a good clip point or drop point. But because this blade is so small, and I can climb right up on this blade if I need to, we'll get into the ergos in a second, it's actually super easy to use this even for your lighter duty tasks. For breaking down your Amazon boxes, cutting tape, cutting twine, cutting packages, cutting light stems in the garden, things like that. This is super easy to use. Because it's so small, because it's so narrow, you do always feel as you're holding this, as you're using this, you never feel far from the edge. And so it's always very easy and intuitive to get that edge right where you need to. Even if you need to get down on a table for a drag cut, something like that, the tip is above the handle, but the handle is so thin, it's not like the tip is like way up here and you have to crank your hand or crank it over to get there. It's still just right within your grip. And so even if I had to use this to, drag through something, pull it through like that, you can see, even if I cant my hand here, I'm not canting my wrist too much to get to that tip. It's still a very accessible tip. And so by putting a trailing point on a small knife like this, especially a small thin knife like this, it ends up being a really strong design choice because you get all the benefits of that trailing point, which is that long gradual belly that is great for your extended cuts. But because it's a small, narrow blade, you don't get the lack of precision that trailing points often have. And so this just ends up being a really good EDC blade. This ends up being a blade that does everything well, and in particular, does a lot of things that 3-inch blades tend to struggle with. If I bring out, there it is, my Biblio. Like the Biblio is another 3-inch knife that came out at about the same time from Giant Mouse. The Biblio is a monster for breaking down boxes, Amazon packages, breaking down twine, your light duty task, envelope paper, stuff like that. Your light duty tasks, this sheep's foot blade is phenomenal. Its edge is super sharp. It's great. But because of how low this tip is and because you don't have that much belly, It's not necessarily that pleasant to use this to break down a bunch of cardboard or to do any sort of longer sweeping cuts. I wouldn't want to use this to skin something because I have to focus on keeping this edge in the cut. As my hand sweeps, very naturally this tip wants to come all the way out of the cut. And it's also because it's so low, sometimes I have to cant my hand back more to get into the cut in the first place. So this ends up being a knife that is optimized for EDC tasks, but struggles outside of those. And this is typical for your 3-inch knives. A lot of 3-inch knives are of that ilk. This guy is not. This guy is a 3-inch knife that ends up being able to do a lot of tasks that are typically larger knife tasks and do them well. It's not awkward to use this to, cut through a bunch of meat. It's not awkward to use this for a longer gardening task where I'm cutting through, a bunch of roots or a bunch of plant stems or something like that. It's quite easy to use. And that was another thing that really surprised me about the Clyde. And then the third thing is the ergonomics. This looks like an ergonomically awkward knife. It looks like a bunch of angles. Now, if you know Giant Mouse, you know that Giant Mouse's ergonomics are uniformly exceptional. It's really the one thing that they are best at. And they are one of the best in the entire knife industry when it comes to ergonomics. You can argue about who's your favorite, though I think it's kind of hard to argue that just for ergonomics, Emerson's are pretty hard to beat. But these are surprisingly great ergonomics, and even for Giant Mouse, these are surprisingly great. Because you see all these blocky edges, and you think, this will feel kind of like holding a brick or holding, a TV remote or something like that, where you've just got angles beaten into your hand. But then when you actually grab it, this kink here, which is not actually that sharp, it's nicely rounded off, naturally sits right in the palm of your hand. This looks flat, but there's actually a gradual sweep to the whole thing. There are chamfers on every edge of this scale. They're subtle. I apologize for the noise in the background if you can hear that, but I'm not going to re-record this whole thing to block it out. You got nice chamfers all the way around here, and you got relatively thin scales. And so this is one of those knives that sort of sits in your fingers and the top of your palm, but you grip it like this, and it doesn't have the typical Giant Mouse jimping. Normally Giant Mouse would put some jimping right about here. Doesn't have it on this one. But this, your fingers wrap around it, this kink sits in your palm, and it just fits nicely and securely in the hand, just like this. Really at the bottom of your fingers there, this little sweep sort of anchors it around your pinky. This kink, because it fits so nicely into your palm, it's just secure. Now, it is a little blocky, it isn't contoured, it is a little angular. If I started to really, really push this hard, like way harder than I would ever reasonably push a 3-inch knife, yes, I would start to feel little hot spots at the, at these edges here, maybe at the liner lock, things like that. But the fact is, for anything you're realistically going to use this knife for, it's plenty comfortable. The other thing that's great about this relatively neutral handle, which again is a bit different for Giant Mouse. Giant Mouse, let's bring out another one. Excuse that noise. Let's bring out the Tribeca here. The Tribeca is neutral by Giant Mouse standards, but it's still got big curves, a big sweep, a big index here, a big choil. The Clyde is very neutral by comparison. The benefit of that neutrality, now obviously when you start to push this knife harder, especially because they don't have the jimping here, that will be a problem. This is going to be a little more squirrely in your hand when you start to push it than some other Giant Mice, but that neutrality means it's very easy to slide up and down this handle. This thing is fantastic in a pinch grip. It kind of feels almost steak knifey in a way. Not that I ever pinch my steak knives, but it's a simple neutral handle that is very easy to clamber up on, pinch that blade, and get lots of control over that edge, get right up to that edge, again, especially for those delicate cuts. This cutout here, which looks like just to access the liner lock, and it is to access the liner lock, also is a really nice anchor point for your middle finger in that grip. It keeps that middle finger in place, makes it feel a little bit more secure in the hand. When you got the full 4-finger grip on the handle, same thing does for your pointer finger and gives you a nice indexing point, a nice anchor point. This isn't a handle that I would say is ideal for hard use, but this whole knife is not ideal for actual hard use. And if you start to get more resistance from the material you're cutting through, you do start to feel that, but it's a very comfortable handle for any task you would reasonably throw at this knife. So, handle design, the design is totally unique. Especially back when it came out, there was nothing that really looked like the Clyde, especially when you combine this blade shape and this handle design. Very unique, very distinctive, and the fact that it is still comfortable in the hand, even with that distinctive design, is a fantastic achievement. And then the last thing that I like about this, which is unusual for me to say about Giant Mouse, is the action is really good. It's a liner lock. The liner lock is very simple. You know, your liner here is just a slab of steel, maybe titanium, I'm not sure. Easy to access here, but this is a very smooth action. Giant Mouse actions, especially back at the time they made the Clyde, often sucked. I've said in my Biblio review, the Biblio had, out of the box, the action was unacceptable. Over time, it became merely mediocre. This is a very smooth washer action. It's phosphor bronze washers, but honestly, it feels like a lot of Teflon actions I've felt. It feels a little bit rubbery, but it's smooth and controlled. This thumb stud is very simple, but very nicely designed. Catches your finger just enough, catches your thumb, I should say, just enough. It's a little lower relative to the pivot than I would like, so you do sort of really have to scoop to get in there, but you can access it, and you don't even have to get in there. You can get on top of it. It'll catch your thumb, and just slow roll it out like that. The detent is not that firm, so it doesn't take that much to start rolling it out. And it's not really a flicker. You can flick it if you want to, but because that action is a little bit tighter, a little bit more rubbery, it feels like it wants to be slow rolled. It's nice. It's a very, especially at, you know, the sub $200 price point that this is playing in, it's a nice action. It's a satisfying action. It gives you sort of the feel of, it's not nearly as glossy and immaculately smooth as a Sebenza, but it feels very much like your Sebenza in that action. And so that's another thing that's just good here. In terms of what I don't like about this knife, there isn't... Oh, I guess one last thing I should say on the part that I do like, and I mentioned this briefly on the blade. The blade is, I'll call it sharp enough. Again, 130,000 on the stock. Not that much space to drop in. It is a flat grind. It's not exactly sharp behind the edge, or it's not like super thin behind the edge. But, and again, this is where that blade shape, where using a short trailing point works so well. It's just so easy to access this edge and so easy to keep it in the cut naturally that you don't even really notice that it's not the sharpest edge in the world, because it's so easy to place the edge exactly where you want it to, put the amount of pressure you need and break through, whether it's tape, whether it's a box, cardboard, a plant stem, something like that. The ergonomics and the overall design of the knife save the fact that it's not the sharpest thing in the world. It's fine, and honestly, if at this price point, they probably couldn't go for a more aggressive grind, and it is a little bit tougher than it would be because it's a relatively shallow grind here, and so it's not the thinnest behind the edge. In terms of things I don't like, there's not actually a lot that I don't like here. Like all Giant Mouse of this era, there's virtually no internal milling. You've got, let me see here. Yeah, you've got a small liner on this side. This side is mostly micarta, but there is a little bit of liner there. And you've got a full liner on the liner lock side. Nothing done to lighten it. It's still a light knife because it's just a small knife. But they could have made this even lighter if they wanted to. They didn't. Giant Mouse never did internal milling back at this point. And it's hard for me to criticize anything else about this knife because the design ends up being so interesting. The amount of utility you get out of it ends up being so surprising that is this going to be the best thing in the world? Is this going to be as good at the Biblio as breaking down boxes? No. But that's the exact same reason it's better than the Biblio at other things. This won't be the best pure EDC utility knife, meaning for just your daily around the house tasks, there will be better knives than this one because of, you know, the ergonomic and blade design choices they've made. But this knife will do a lot of things that maybe you don't do every day. It'll do those other tasks better than your quote-unquote EDC specialty knives do. So there's not a lot for me to criticize on this one, especially at the price point that they're at. You're not getting immaculate fit and finish, and let's just jump into fit and finish. First off, the micarta the Giant Mouse uses is always very good, and this is no exception. This is a very nice denim linen micarta, very uniform. It's got that light fuzziness to it, but not that much. Everything is, screws are pretty much flush here. This one's slightly proud and crowned. Your blade grind here, it's a little soft. I do wish this edge here was a little bit more pronounced. That schmutz on there, that's from me using it. Your plunge is fine. The crowning is nice. I would have loved to see some Giant Mouse typical jimping right here, but they didn't put it on this for whatever reason. The etch is always very nicely done, very clean. A little fuzzy on the mouse on that one, but it's fine. Again, the one thing on the blade is I do wish this line here was a little bit crisper. It does feel a little fuzzy. Handles are nicely finished. Great micarta. This micarta, by the way, darkens very little with use. I've used this quite a bit, and you can see only a little bit of darkening from the original color, which is interesting. That's just with how tight the micarta weave is, I think. You got your typical brass backspacer here, which helps balance the knife a little bit toward the butt, which feels satisfying in this case. Your liner lock is utilitarian, meaning tons of access, some nice jimping. It's fine. There's nothing special about it. It's meant to be functional, and it is functional. Your action, as I mentioned, is honestly better than I would expect from a Giant Mouse of this period. It's not going to be immaculately smooth like a Sabenta, but the fact is all of this is in a $175 knife. $175 knife made in Italy. And I'm not going to complain about any of the execution here on a $175 knife. To put it this way, there is nothing about the fit and finish here that is impressive. It's a very simple design. You know, they don't even contour this one. Most Giant Mouse knives are contoured. These are flat scales. But at that price point, there's nothing here that I am disappointed in. It doesn't feel high-end. It doesn't feel necessarily refined. Even in the way that modern Giant Mouse, the newer Giant Mouse designs do. But there's nothing bad here. If you like this design, you will be fine paying $175 for it. And honestly, this one gets a pretty hefty discount on the secondary market. You can probably get this knife for $125, $150 on the secondary market. So if you do want to save some money, look into that route. Here, before I get to final conclusions, let me just talk about the brass version here, because there is a brass version of the Clyde which has M390, so basically the same steel, and it's the exact same thing, except this is brass scales with a titanium backspacer rather than micarta scales or G10 scales, and a brass backspacer. If you really like brass, then this is cool, but there is no way, nobody that I would recommend this for over the other one, because it ends up eroding a couple of the things that make the Clyde so good. The biggest one is weight. My favorite thing about the Clyde, the thing I let off on the good, is how light and easy this is to carry. But this goes from 2.81 ounces to 4.3 ounces. You get an ounce and a half extra on what was a 3-ounce knife. It's basically a 50% increase in weight. And because the knife is so small, you also get a dramatic change in balance, where this becomes very, very handle heavy. The blade feels like a feather sticking out of a heavy handle. And that just makes the ergonomics a little bit more awkward. This blade starts to feel a little further away when so much of that weight is in the handle. You don't have the nice bit of texture that the micarta gives you, which helps with the ergonomics. These edges feel a little bit harsher when they're made of a metal like brass rather than having a softer material like micarta here. So, as a user, this knife is just, inferior to the micarta version. And honestly, if I had tried the brass version before I tried the micarta version, I don't think I would have been nearly as favorable on the Clyde, because this one would have soured my initial impression. I don't like this knife. I certainly don't like using this knife. It's cool. I do like brass on my knives, but especially with this one here, which is brass with no internal milling anywhere, this thing is heavy. It's a chunk. It feels like a chunk. It's quite hard to recommend this unless you really like brass. But final conclusions. Final conclusion on the Giant Mouse Ace Clyde is this, for many, many reasons, is a knife that I was greatly surprised by and liked much more than I expected. The carry profile, it cannot be overstated how good the carry profile is. This is literally one of the only knives I can think of that really sits neck and neck with the Sebenza in terms of how much usable blade and how much of a useful knife you get in how small of a carry profile. And it's even lighter than the Sebenza, and frankly, if anything, even a little smaller than the Sebenza in the pocket. This blade design is really smart in the size of the knife that they made. It would be awkward in a larger knife. That's why I'm not sure I'd be a fan of the GMX, their integral version of this, of the Clyde, which unusually came out after the Ace version. But this short trailing point blade has a ton of utility. You combine it with a handle that has surprisingly great ergonomics, and this just ends up being a very useful, very carryable, just fun and easy to have around knife that I have really enjoyed using, both for EDC tasks and for stuff that EDC knives often struggle with, the knives this size often struggle with. Great in the garden, great around the house, things like that. And on top of that, the fact that you get a quite Sebenza-like action even at this lower price point, this is a decent option. If somebody is getting into knives and wants something, they say, you know, okay, I've heard about this Sebenza. I've heard it's the top of the pile or one of the best things out there. What should I get if I want to sort of get that feeling, if I want sort of a Sebenza light? This is a really good option that's less than half the price of the Sebenza these days. If you want that same feeling, if you want that same versatility, if you want that same great carry profile, you want a knife that both can do those small tasks but can do bigger tasks as well, really good option here. Probably the design of Giant Mouse's early design that has held up the best. And certainly if they were to update it and just, refine the fit and finish a little bit more in a Clyde V2, they could have a really impressive knife even for 2024, with a few just small refinements on fit and finish just to take it up a level, just to the level that they're operating at with their newer designs. None of it's an issue here, and the fact is, if you get this knife for $175, and especially if you get it for $125 to $150 on the secondary market, you're going to be very happy. And I think that, like me, you will be surprised at how much of a joy it is to carry, and even more so, how much of a joy it is to use. So definitely a recommendable knife here with the Giant Mouse Ace Clyde. Hope you find that useful. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, please drop them down in the comments. I'd love to get feedback from viewers. Let me know if there are any knives you want me to look at, and I hope this was a good use of your time, and I will see you again soon.